All right. Good morning, everybody. Class number 4 today. Let me just share my screen for a second. There we go. So, welcome. So, this is our fourth session on going through what I call the 5 overlooked thinkers in modern Jewish life. They're not really overlooked because these are relatively household names, but they oftentimes don't make it into the, I don't know, top 5 to 10 people that you might get on every source sheet. And each one of these thinkers explores ideas in, I think, fascinating and provocative ways through both Jewish history, academia, and also modern day politics. Today is in some way one of the classes that I was the most excited for because David Hartman, both in terms of his own writings and ideas, and also in terms of the institute that he set up in Israel, I think in many ways has been a flagship institute to push two very provocative claims that we're going to get into in class today. So rather than endlessly make you wait, I will pop right in. We'll talk a little bit about a sort of biography of Hartman, and then we will get right into his ideas. Let me just take off the waiting room. There we go. Okay. So, who was David Hartman? So, I put a couple of news clippings from when Hartman passed away about 13 years ago. And we kind of, tell a little bit of a story as to his legacy through these news clippings. So, on the one hand, on the top right, we see the New York Times said Rabbi David Hartman, champion of an adaptive Judaism. We'll explore a little bit what he meant by Judaism being adaptive in a minute. Then Slate magazine writes why an Orthodox institution's decision to ordain female rabbis isn't as revolutionary as it sounds. And that is talking about the Hartman Institute and one of the things that the Hartman Institute has been doing, and we'll to this at the very end, has been pushing for female ordination within the Orthodox world. And then on the bottom right, we have Haaretz, Rabbi David Hartman, the passionate leader of Orthodox renewal. And so we have, very, very different descriptive claims of who David Hartman was. And a little bit of background to go into before we hop into some of his ideas is that David Hartman was born in the 1930s in Brooklyn. And so if we think about, if we just contextualize with our first three thinkers, Hartman was born about 30 to 40 years after all these thinkers. So obviously Hartman did live through the Holocaust and founding of the state of Israel, but he was not yet a, mainstream thinker during the Holocaust and the state of Israel, which in many ways places him a generation after people like Gershom Scholem and Leo Strauss and Yeshayahu Lebowitz. And we'll talk about how his being in history as the generation after many of the thinkers to go through the Holocaust, I think formed a series of provocative ideas, especially in his most provocative essay about the Holocaust, which we'll talk about in about 10 minutes. And David Hartman grew up in the Lakewood yeshiva system. And for those who know inside Orthodox baseball, there's a big Orthodox Jewish community in Lakewood, New Jersey, and this is associated much more with what one would call yeshivish. So yeshivish, for those not familiar with the term, we have Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox is very much a umbrella category. Within Orthodox, there's probably 20 different subgroups. So we have our first two subgroups. We have the Hasidic Orthodox community, and we have what's called the Litvak or non-Hasidic Orthodox community. That was already a break that happened 300 years ago. I think we've talked about that in class before. If anyone is curious to dive in more, feel free to stop and ask me questions. So we have the Hasidic half of Orthodoxy, and we have the non-Hasidic half of Orthodoxy. And then throughout the 18 and 1900s, both the Hasidic half of Orthodoxy and the Litvak / non-Hasidic half of Orthodoxy obviously splintered into many different groups with differing views on everything from theology to philosophy to theories of change in Jewish law. And within the non-Hasidic, the Litvak group, Lakewood and Yeshivish community, is a type of what some might call ultra-Orthodoxy, but it's not as ultra-Orthodoxy as if you think about the people in, say, Mea Sharim. They're sort of borderline between modern Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy. That's my attempt at a sociologic explanation. But needless to say, the Lakewood world is relatively non-liberal when it comes to playing around with Jewish law and change. And this is something that David Hartman is going to in some way rebel against his upbringing by being both a student in the Lakewood Yeshiva. He eventually then went to Yeshiva University, which is one jump to the left in the Orthodox world, right? Yeshiva University, the flagship modern Orthodox institution. And then Hartman is going to become a community rabbi for many years, and he's going to continuously push orthodoxy to its leftmost bounds, even leaving the orbit of what would be considered the normative modern Orthodox world. So in the 1970s, he eventually makes Aliyah, and he sets up the Shalom Hartman Institute, which we'll talk about towards the end, and how that ends up affecting his legacy. So trying to understand David Hartman, and again, one of the things that's been a lot of fun about talking about these different thinkers is they all comment on roughly similar things. They just obviously have different opinions. And one of Hartman's most important books is a book called The Living Covenant. Now, we can already sort of deduce a central claim of his book talking about Torah being called a living covenant, which means Torah must be alive, which seems sort of obvious, but we take a peek. This is from the second page of the book, and he writes, a covenantal vision of life with mitzvah as the central organizing principle in the relationship between Jews and God liberates the intellect and moral will. I seek to show that a tradition mediated by the Sinai covenant can encourage the development of a human being who is not afraid to assume responsibility for the ongoing drama of Jewish history. Passive resignation is not seen to be an essential trait of one whose relationship to God is mediated by the hearing of mitzvot. So Hartman's already going to start off with a pretty far-reaching claim. In other words, he's going to talk about Judaism as a partnership between humans and God, unlike Judaism being some sort of, you might think of it as a dictatorship, right? Which may be the prevailing view in much of the Lakewood world, right? Much of the yeshivish world is that, well, God says a bunch of things, and it's, the Jewish people's job to follow Jewish law and to follow what God wants without much of reinterpretation, or without much, what he's calling intellectual and moral will on behalf of the Jewish people. Hartman is going to argue against that, and he's going to make a pretty strong claim that to be Jewish means not subjugating your own morality and your own intellect into the service of what God wants, but it is a reciprocal relationship between humans and God. I didn't put this on the slide because, I have to be very careful with staying within the bounds of an hour. But when we talked about Yeshayahu Lebowitz 2 weeks ago, one of the most radical claims of Yeshayahu Lebowitz, if you remember, is Lebowitz's claim that the Akedah in Genesis 22 is the quintessential Jewish story, because when God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, Abraham does it, and this represents for Lebowitz what is considered pure religion. Again, for Lebowitz, being Jewish necessarily requires the pushing aside of anything that might have any ethical or sociologic or political ramifications for what Yeshayahu Lebowitz calls, the pure search of Torah or pure halacha. And so if Lebowitz is all the way on one end of saying that the goal of somebody in the Jewish community is purely to practice Jewish law, right, is to not attach any ethical or intellectual or philosophic or political ends to your practice of Jewish law, Hartman is all the way on the opposite extreme. Hartman actually responds to Lebowitz's claim that the Akedah is the quintessential Jewish story and pushes back and says that actually it's Genesis 18 that's the quintessential Jewish story, which, for those that need a reminder, Genesis 18 is when Abraham specifically argues back to God when God is about to kill the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And this, for Hartman, again, represents this fascinating dichotomy of Jewish philosophy. Just to take a step back, because I think this is one of the most interesting things to think about in terms of where Jewish thinkers fall on the spectrum. For Yeshayahu Lebowitz, he writes, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago, but just to bring it up again, because I think it's illustrative. For Lebowitz, Genesis 18 needed to be corrected by Genesis 22. In other words, the fact that Abraham believed that him as a human being could challenge God's intellect and morality, for Lebowitz, for Abraham to become the father of the Jewish people, he needed to be taught, really, Judaism is more like Genesis 22. In other words, we have a series of things that we're asked to do as Jews. We do it. We don't spend time questioning, well, is this, culturally, does this culturally suit us? Is this ethical? What kind of political system is going to create right? You sort of fully buy into the halachic system, and that's what it means to be a Jew. For Lebowitz, for Hartman, it's the exact opposite. For Hartman, you can imagine that Genesis 18 was the quintessential Jewish moment, and perhaps Genesis 22, when Abraham did not argue back against God, perhaps that was somewhat of a mistake on Abraham's part. And so in many ways, at least in terms of their Jewish view, you can view Hartman as on the opposite end of the spectrum from Yeshayahu Lebowitz. And interestingly enough, we'll see this in about 20 minutes, this will also affect Hartman's view of Israel and Zionism as well. But we'll get there. So for Hartman, Judaism and Jewish law is not static, but constantly changing. Again, we've talked a number of times through different thinkers, and one of the most interesting debates that was involved in the Jewish community in the 1800s, I want to argue, is still an implicit debate that is continuously happening between the Orthodox community and many non-Orthodox communities, is the role of how to understand history within Judaism. Not the question of whether or not Jews have history, right? Everybody knows we can go back 1,000 years in the past and you'll find Jews living in Spain and Morocco and France. But the question of how do you understand history within our current conception of Judaism? And I'll give sort of two examples on both sides. One could say, and this was actually Yeshayahu Lebowitz's claim, that history has no bearing on Judaism today. In other words, one could admit that Jews have a history and that Jewish law and the Talmud and Jewish text have evolved over time. But to say, right, that has no bearing on how we see Judaism today. Judaism today is a pure, unadulterated, right, timeless phenomenon. Or one can have another perspective. This was actually the perspective of Gershom Scholem we saw week one. This is also going to be the perspective of David Hartman, who's going to say, no, Judaism has always been changing, right? There's never been such a thing as pure Judaism that you could, figure out how to, brush away all of the interesting socio-political and historic phenomenon around it. Judaism is constantly dynamic. It's constantly changing. There have always been debates within the Jewish community as to how to understand things, from Jewish practice to God to politics to all of these things. And that's actually a feature, not a bug. In other words, Judaism is shaped by history. Now, Hartman's not discounting the theologic element, right? He's not saying Judaism is only a historic phenomenon, but he believes that Judaism certainly has been shaped by history. And those today, again, his main criticism is of the vast majority of the Orthodox community. That's what he spent most of his time thinking about. Again, he's a product of the Orthodox community. To the best of anyone's knowledge, he remained in the Orthodox community, so he does not leave the Orthodox community. And for all available knowledge, he still practiced Orthodox halacha his entire life, but much of his philosophic criticism of Judaism was levied towards the Jewish community, and much of it was because of, again, this dynamic of much of the Orthodox community saying that the role of Judaism in the modern era is to be as static as possible and unchanging, and him saying that's actually not how Judaism ever was. In other words, the biggest irony, and then I'll leave this point aside and move on. The biggest irony that I think Hartman would agree with is that to claim that Judaism should be static is actually a radical change. In other words, you could think of the ultra-Orthodox community with its claim that Judaism shouldn't change, that Judaism should continue to be the same thing year after year after year, reflecting what Jews were doing 200 or 300 years ago. That in and of itself is actually a radical reshaping of Judaism, right? So if you never change something, that thing doesn't stay the same. That thing actually erodes. And right, there's many different analogies we could think of. In other words, if you have a house that you really like, right, wherever you live, and you say, well, I really like the way that my house is now, so I'm just going to do no maintenance on it for the next 50 years. In 50 years from now, you're not going to be left with the same nice house you have now. You're going to be left with a house that is pretty dysfunctional and needs a lot of fixing up, right? Now, obviously, there's a question that one can ask on the other side, which is, well, how quickly can you change your house for it to be the same house if you really like your house, right? And that, I think, is an interesting dynamic that different Jewish thinkers have to think about. But for Hartman, the mainstream Orthodox claim of we don't want to change things too much, that was a departure from how Jews classically understood Judaism. And he writes, again, in this book, it's a fascinating book for those who are interested, that the Torah should not be understood as being complete. In other words, the idea that, what we consider Torah is an ongoing conversation, and that every generation has to re-understand the Torah in their own terms. He was very fond of the teaching. This actually goes back to the Talmud, but really it was highlighted by many of the Hasidic teachers that every Jew had their own personal insight as to how to understand Torah. In other words, there could be 600,000, or today, there's 14.5 million Jews, so there's 14.5 million different interpretations and ways to see the Torah, and it has to be mediated by the experience of the Jewish people. And because of this, and this sort of, I think, naturally follows, for Hartman, Jewish law is not an authoritarian system. In other words, I gave the analogy before of how many could think of Judaism as, God is the authoritarian or God is the king, and the king gives you a list of things to do, and you follow the king because the king has more power, or the king can reward or punish you, or because, our intellect or ethics are dwarfed in comparison to the king, right? One could have that view of religion. And Hartman very much pushed against that and said that Judaism is not an authoritarian type system where we're just endlessly following God because we can't know any better. But Judaism actually has to be a covenantal relationship between the Jewish people and God. And he used this term, and I thought this was an interesting joke that he's made in many of his writings. I spent 2 summers a couple years ago studying at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and this analogy made it into classes. So I thought I'd share this with you. The rabbis and the medieval Jewish tradition have this phrase that they use, the sea of Talmud. And this is a phrase that comes up a lot in the traditional Jewish community. And again, the idea is that seas are, oceans are very vast, right? And they are shaped by different forces, right? There are many waves. And so there's a lot of dynamicism in the sea, right? Waves are always moving. There's always ebbs and tides and flows. And this is a very fitting analogy that the rabbis of the Talmud gave to their project because of all of the diversity and ebbing and flowing and changing. And also seas are very big. And Hartman's critique of much of the Orthodox community, again, this is specifically aimed at the more yeshivish community, is that they've turned the Sea of Talmud into what he calls the bathtub of the Shulchan Aruch, right? Bathtubs are obviously much smaller than oceans. Hopefully your bathtub is not having waves in it or undergoing tides. And also and in terms of Shulchan Aruch, right, this goes back to a fascinating debate that happened in the late Middle Ages. I won't bore you too much with this historic debate so we can get on to more of Hartman's views. But there was always a debate in the Jewish community about whether or not Jewish law should be mediated by Jewish legal codes or whether or not Jewish law should be mediated by different communities' interpretation. So here's one way to think of this. Starting in Fez, in Morocco, in the Middle Ages, a rabbi named Alfasi, or Isaac Alfasi, right? His pen name is the Rif, R-I-F, decides to take the Talmud, right? This massive corpus of multi-thousand pages, and say, right, I don't know if the average Jew, one, can handle going through this, and I don't want the average Jew to possibly be misled by incorrect interpretations. And so Alfasi takes the Talmud, he takes a scissors and glue stick, I'm being a little bit facetious here, and he creates a new version of the Talmud that is only 20% of the original Talmud, cutting out all of the debates, just leaving the bottom line conclusion. Now, for those that have ever studied Talmud, Talmud is all about debate, right? Oftentimes you'll open a page of Talmud, you'll have 2 rabbis debating about what the proper, say, order of the blessings are that you say on Passover, right? To give an example, the rabbis will debate for 2 pages, and then oftentimes at the end, the Talmud will not even give you the conclusion, right? And so it's up to the interpreter, right? If you sit down and you're trying to figure out with your family, say you're in Provence in the year 1000 and you're about to celebrate Passover, you as a community member might have to say, okay, there's this debate in the Talmud, which one do I think is correct? Which one does the community do, right? You have to actively engage with the text. Starting with Alfasi, there became a tradition of rabbinic leaders saying, I'm just going to write out the code, right, and give people the answer, right? It's a difference between Jewish law being a process and Jewish law being a conclusion. And starting with Alfasi, and again, Maimonides also writes a code called the Mishnah Torah, and then later on there's another code called the Torah, but the most famous Jewish legal code ends up being called the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch was written in the 16th century in Tzfat, and by a man named Joseph Cairo. And for those that know Hebrew, the Shulchan Aruch, right, if we just think about what these words mean, Shulchan Aruch means a set table, right? What is the metaphor of a set table? You don't need to do anything. In other words, if I show up to your house and all the food's already on the table, there's a tablecloth, all the silverware's out, the drinks are poured, the food's there, I just show up and eat, right? It actually requires no help or no work on my part. And so what Kyra was attempting to do with the Shulchan Aruch is he writes in his introduction, I've called my work the set table because somebody that knows, that has no background, can read it and know exactly what they need to do. Now, on the one hand, this probably is quite useful if you think about a Jewish community that doesn't have access to texts, or people that don't have time to think about what they need to do and things like that. But on the other hand, and this was, I think, Hartman's point of the bathtub of the Shulchan Aruch, it is a slippery slope. If you think of Jewish law as just a bunch of conclusions, it's a slippery slope until that creates a Jewish community that's not actually critically engaging with ideas. They're just opening books to figure out exactly what they need to do. In other words, Jewish codes, if viewed incorrectly, could change Judaism into an authoritarian-like system, in the sense of people are no longer thinking for themselves. They're just saying, well, what does the authority say to do? Okay, I'll do this, without ever understanding all of the pieces that go into making the decision. And that actually stops them from being able to lend their own voice into the conversation. And so much of Hartman's early work, right, his book, Living Covenant, essentially, I gave you a pretty vast summary of the book, is specifically arguing against this. And one of the stories that Hartman focuses on, we'll do a little bit of a Talmud study, possibly the most famous Talmud story. So I'm going to guess some of you may have heard the story. If not, get ready for a bit of a wild ride. But the rabbis in the Talmud, 1,600 years ago in Babylon, end up debating whether or not an oven is kosher. Now, without going too much into the details, because there's a lot of background knowledge to know, this is not going to be important for the later debate. The rabbis end up getting into a debate between Rabbi Eliezer, who says that a certain oven is pure, and the rabbis, in other words, everybody else in the room, who say that an oven is impure, right? The exact details, again, if you want to stay extra, we can go into it. But this is a classic debate, right? The Talmud is full with debates. But in this case, something different happens. And let's just pop to where my mouse is. The sages taught on the day when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanation. So you have a classic debate. Rabbi Eliezer is convinced that this oven is pure, and he is trying to make his case to the rabbis. Again, the Talmud doesn't even tell us what the argument was about. In other words, we don't even know what Rabbi Eliezer's points were or what the rabbi's points were. All we know at this point, they were debating about whether or not an oven is pure or not. Rabbi Eliezer said it was pure. He kept trying to convince the rabbis, and the rabbis were not listening to his rational explanations. Here's where the story becomes interesting and strange. So after failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer says, can you hear me now? Perfect. Okay, so I'll back up a couple of lines. Rabbi Eliezer tries to convince them rationally. They're not listening, and Rabbi Eliezer turns to the tree that's next door and says, I'm going to show you that I'm correct by dint of miraculous powers, right? The assumption being that the ability to perform miracles implies that you are correct, right? You're tapping into, right? God wouldn't let you perform a miracle unless you were correct. So Rabbi Eliezer makes this tree fly into the air, and the rabbis look at this tree and they say, one does not cite halachic proof from the tree. In other words, the rabbis are convinced, and they say, very impressive, magic trick you did there, but we're not going to accept your argument because you made a tree fly. So then he says, if I'm right, this river will flow backwards. He has a river flow backwards. The rabbis reject that also, right? So he's performing all these miracles. He then tries one more time. He says, if I'm correct, the walls of the Beit Midrash or study hall will prove it, and the walls of the synagogue begin to collapse on him, and Rabbi Yeshua, who was the leader of the opposition camp said, he scolded the walls and said, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halacha, what is your nature in the dispute? So the rabbis are unimpressed by his miracles of the walls parting in. And here's where we get to the, the crux of the story. So finally, Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm correct, then heaven will prove it. So he says, enough of this debate, enough of these miracles. If I'm right, God will come and say that I'm right. And what happens? A divine voice emerges from heaven and says, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the halacha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion? In other words, Eliezer says, God is going to come into the synagogue, into the Beit Midrash, and tell you that I am correct. So what happens? Rabbi Yoshua stands on his feet and he says, it is written in the Torah, it is not in heaven. Right? The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, it is not in heaven in this context? Rabbi Yirmiyah, one of the other rabbis that was there, said, since the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, we do not care about what God has to say, as you have already wrote in Mount Sinai. After a majority, you should rule. Since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer, the law is not ruled in accordance with his opinion, right? This ends up being one of the most famous Talmudic stories, because essentially what this is saying is the rabbis in their understanding of the Talmud are actually willing to argue with everybody, including God. But then the story concludes, and I'll rope this back into Hartman's thesis in a second. The Gemara relates that years after Rabbi Nathan encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time when Rabbi Yoshua issued his declaration? Elijah said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me, my children have triumphed over me. In other words, for Hartman, this was the quintessential Jewish story in terms of how Jews have to understand the world. To be in a covenantal relationship, according to Hartman, does not mean a top-down relationship with God where our only ability as people in the Jewish community is to just mindlessly follow everything God wants. But as Hartman noted, from the earliest days of our tradition, from Abraham arguing with God in Genesis 18 in Sodom, and the rabbis willing to argue with God about the ritual laws of an oven, Judaism has always understood itself to be in dynamic relationship to authority figures, both human and also God. And to strip Judaism away from this is actually in some way a rejection of the way that Judaism and Jewish law has long understood itself. Before getting into sort of the second half of Hartman's thesis and sort of his worldview of how he thinks about Israel and Zionism, which is a whole other fascinating angle that we'll spend the next 20, 25 minutes on. Any thoughts or questions? And I'll unshare my screen for a second to see if anyone has thoughts up until now.
Rabbi, that saying from the bathtub of the Shulchan Aruch to the Sea of Talmud, I think it's a great saying that, Torah, when you think about Shulchan Aruch, you're supposed to, the individual person can read at the table. It's the book of Proverbs, very organic. So, you can just picture, here's this one guy sitting in a bathtub reading Shulchan Aruch, gaining knowledge of the Torah. And then on the other side, here are these great Talmudic scholars also interpreting Torah. And so you got like a micro vision and a macro vision of what Torah could be. And the dynamic is both. From the little guy sitting in the bathtub to the great scholars fighting over it.
Totally. And I think also to his point, turning a sea into a bathtub is an act of shrinking. And I think the reason why I brought up the medieval debate about legal codes, and again, today we don't really think about it in the Jewish community, right? Everybody that is involved in the subject of Jewish law, right, understands that, you want to know what to do on Shabbat. Okay, you open up either the Shulchan Aruch or a more recent code, right? So maybe the Mishnah Brura, or even now they have in English, right? They have tons of books about keeping a kosher kitchen and keeping a Shomer Shabbat house and the laws of, mourning and the laws of, getting married. So we don't think of it as a radical act, right? The idea of taking Jewish law, which is supposed to be this dynamic thing, and again, writing it down into what's called, statutory law. In other words, line by line law. But it is quite the radical act because it does lose some of the dynamicism. And the rabbis in the Talmud actually recognize this. And, I wasn't planning on going on this, brief tangent, but I think it's illustrative. The rabbis in the Talmud actually had a very difficult time rationalizing their need to actually write down the Talmud or the Mishnah in the first place. In other words, right, we call Talmud oral Torah, right? So, for those unaware, right, typically the idea is that we actually have not two Torahs, but two different types of Torah. We have the written Torah, right? That is the stuff, the thing we read in Shul and in the scrolls. And then we have oral Torah, right? These are the discussions and debates about how to apply Torah to real life. Now, there's something ironic when you point to a written book and you tell somebody this is oral Torah, right? Well, which is it? Is it written or is it oral, right? Oral is the opposite of written. And the rabbis understood this, and the rabbis actually had a very difficult time when they were forced, because of historic circumstances of the destruction of the temple and scattering of the Jewish people and Jews starting to move to all four corners of the earth, to actually rationalize why they should be writing down an oral tradition. They ultimately decided they needed to because they were afraid that the tradition would get lost as Jews go into the diaspora, and they were probably correct, given historic reality. But it's the same thing with Jewish law and Shulchan Aruch as well, right? It's not saying the Shulchan Aruch is bad per se, right? But it's to say that if you only understand Judaism through the Shulchan Aruch, and you only understand how to practice Judaism through one legal code, you are in some sense not, right? It's almost as if you, instead of reading a great book, right? So imagine, you assign the book 1984 to a group of high schoolers, right? To really engage with what George Orwell was writing about. And instead of reading it, they end up reading a 3-paragraph summary of what the book is saying. Now, you could ask, right, have they gotten the main point of the book? And the answer, in some sense, is yes, right? If they can memorize a summary of what the book is, they in some way have understood what the book was doing. But most of us would probably say, if you've never read the book and just read a 2-paragraph summary, you don't really understand the book. And one could make the same claim about Judaism, right? If your entire knowledge of Judaism is coming from a Jewish statutory code, such as the Mishnah Torah or Shulchan Aruch or, more recent ones, right? Yes, you understand, Shabbat, right? You understand what you need to do on Shabbat, but you don't understand the process, and you're not a part of that conversation. And I think that was the point for Hartman. So, any other thoughts or questions before we get into Zionism? Amazing. Okay, So one of the things that we've talked about, and again, all modern thinkers in the Jewish community have to formulate Zionism and Israel into their wider understanding of Judaism and what it's doing there. And just to remind you, because we've seen 3 fascinating thinkers over the last 3 weeks, and Hartman's going to be a 4th fascinating thinker. For Scholem, Zionism was in some way a victory of the messianic force over the overly legalistic force in the Jewish community, going back to even radical figures such as Shabtai Tzvi. And so Gershom Scholem understands Zionism almost as a type of neo-messianism, even though Zionism was a secular movement. So for Scholem, Zionism has messianic tinges to it. For Yeshayahu Lebowitz, Zionism is nothing but a political state. In other words, for Yeshayahu Lebowitz, we talked about him 2 weeks ago, for Jews to ascribe any religious significance to the state of Israel is in many ways an act of idolatry, right? Judaism in Israel, right? He was a Zionist, right? But for him, Zionism was purely political. For Leo Strauss, who thought about this more politically, Zionism, again, is in some way a movement to counteract what he calls the failures of liberalism. We talked about that last week. In many ways, Hartman is going to disagree with all the above. And Hartman is going to start by pointing something out that I think, we've implicitly discussed before, but just to lay it out explicitly. And he writes an essay called Zionism as a Revolution in Self-Understanding. And he says as follows. He says, Zionism has never really known itself completely. In other words, that Zionism is based on a tension or Zionism itself is confused. What's it confused about? Whether it is a movement of continuation and continuity or a movement of rebellion. In other words, you could ask this meta question about Zionism. In fact, I think it's the most interesting question to ask about Zionism. And the question is Zionism part of Jewish tradition or a continuation of Jewish tradition, Or is Zionism a rebellion against Jewish tradition? And what Hartman says is, in my opinion, it is manifestly obvious that these two trends have determined the essence of Zionism as a living thing with a dialectic of its own, and also determined all the troubles we are confronted with today. So for Hartman, Zionism is a dialectic. Again, a dialectic is you have two opposite ideas that are sort of pushing against each other and dancing around in the creation of a third idea that's in many ways a combination or a synthesis of the first two ideas. And so for Hartman, Zionism is both a radical movement of Jewish continuity and also a radical movement of Jewish rebellion. But he goes on, he says, is Zionism a movement that seeks a continuation of what has been the Jewish tradition throughout the generations, or has it come to introduce a change into the historic phenomenon called Judaism? We all know that when we speak of Judaism, we are speaking of something that exists, but which is difficult to define. Nor is there, in my opinion, any need to define it. The question is whether we have wanted to alter fundamentally the phenomenon called Judaism or to continue it. Right? So he paints this question, and then he spends most of his life answering this question in the affirmative. In other words, for Hartman, Zionism becomes a continuation of classic Judaism, but with a radical new twist. And Hartman's going to write this over the series of many essays, and this is in some way what the entire Hartman Institute is based around today. We'll get there in about 20 minutes. But for Hartman, Israel and Zionism is a normative part of Jewish tradition and Jewish culture, right? He was certainly a Zionist. Unlike Yeshayahu Lebowitz, though, again, in many ways, you can think of him as almost on the opposite side of Lebowitz on many of these questions. For Hartman, because Zionism is a movement of Jewish continuity, Zionism must be guided by Judaism in some way. Now, it's important to note he was not a theocrat. In other words, you can ask a question, and this is a question that, we can probably spend 3 hours on, so I'll try to do it in 45 seconds. And the question is, we all know that Israel is a Jewish state, right? What does that mean, right? There's a couple of different things that can mean. Is Israel an ethnic Jewish state? Is it a religious Jewish state? Or is it a cultural or / social Jewish state, right? Here's an example of each, right? We all know what it would be like if Israel was a religious Jewish state. In other words, we just talked about Jewish law and the Shulchan Aruch, right? One could imagine, this is certainly not the case, but one could imagine a reality in which the prime minister of Israel, every time they have to figure out what a new law should be, would open up the Shulchan Aruch from the 16th century and see, okay, this is the law, right? So a question comes up, right? Should hospitals serve non-kosher food in Israel? And they open up the Shulchan Aruch and it says, no Jew should be eating kosher. So, okay, no, hospitals should not be serving unkosher food in Israel, right? Another question, should it be legal for Jews to raise pig and run, to sell pork in Israel, right? You open up the Shulchan Aruch, Jews are not supposed to eat pork. Okay, it's illegal for Jews to raise pigs in Israel. By the way, both those examples I gave are actually both Israeli law, both the chametz and hospitals and also pig. So it's a little bit more complicated than saying Israel is not does not get ruled by Jewish law at all. But there is a natural end to that. But one could imagine a Israel in which it becomes much more religious in terms of its politics, and Israel can be a Jewish state by dint of it being a religious Jewish state, right? That's one version. A second version is Judaism, Israel can be just purely an ethnic / political Jewish state, right? This is the view of people like, Theodor Herzl, who, of course, wanted nothing to do with religion called Judaism. And what this means is you have a state of Israel, and you say, inside the state, we're not going to have any, religion, but this is going to be a place where historically oppressed Jewish people, right, aka anybody who's Jewish by ethnicity, is going to be able to seek refuge in, right? If Israel is an ethnic Jewish state, it would probably be a good idea to have laws such as the right of return for Jews. In other words, Jews anywhere from former Soviet Union to Iraq to Poland, if they needed refuge, right, Israel is welcoming to all Jews. And even more than that, Israel views it as its mission not just to serve its own citizenry, but also to protect Jews worldwide, right? So one could have that view of Israel, right? There's a third view of Israel, and you can say, well, Israel shouldn't be just an ethnic Jewish state or a religious Jewish state. We should use Jewish culture to help help guide Israel in in some wider way. So I'll give one practical idea and I'll give one esoteric idea. A practical idea that Israel, of course, does is you could say America is a culturally Christian country, right? What do I mean by that, right? I'm not making any radical political claims here, but what I'm saying is I know for a fact that next year I will not be teaching at UCI on Christmas, right? No matter what else happens, right, in the world between now and next December 25th, it doesn't matter what day of the week December 25th is on, I know I will not have class on Christmas, right? I already planned my vacation for next year Christmas. Why do I know that? Because we obviously use a calendar that's connected to Christianity, and we know that Christmas is always off. I don't know that about Yom Kippur, right? Every year on Yom Kippur, I have to figure out months in advance when Yom Kippur is, or Rosh Hashanah, or Sukkot, or all the holidays, and I have to consciously figure out, okay, am I teaching this day? Do I take off, right? What do I do with my class? Do I have someone else teach it, right? So Israel, as a culturally Jewish country, right, one version of that, right, the simple version is just to say, okay, Israel is going to be culturally Jewish the same way America is culturally Christianity, right? The calendar is going to revolve around the Jewish calendar, right? So in Israel, right, you might be working on Christmas, but you always know you're going to be off on Yom Kippur. Or perhaps many of the public symbolism. So instead of many veteran memorials having massive crosses, we'll have veteran memorials having, big Magen Davids, right? Jewish symbolism. A more esoteric version, and this was very much Hartman's idea, and we'll talk about this a little bit in about 10 minutes at the end, is that Israel as a Jewish country needs to be underpinned or scaffolded by the timeless Jewish debates that Jews have been having about issues of politics and morality and ethics and law that Jews have been having throughout all of history. In other words, it's not a one-to-one relationship of you open up the Shulchan Aruch and apply that law to Israel, but given Hartman's premise that Judaism is a constant dynamic system of constantly questioning and challenging and thinking provocatively about things, of course, one should want to ensure that that way of thinking Jewishly and about Jewish tradition makes it into our understanding of Israel. And I'll give you an example of how Hartman does this, right? He does this in all sorts of interesting ways. And I'll give you one interpretation, right? This is going to seem, very much in the weeds here, but again, most good Jewish thinkers start very much in the weeds and then, come out with big ideas. And Hartman's going to note that if you look at how Maimonides formulates his laws of Hanukkah, right? I promise this will amount to something that connects in a second. Maimonides says the following about the laws of Hanukkah, right? He says, the precept of lighting the Hanukkah lamp is exceedingly precious, and one should carefully observe it in order to acclaim the miracle, ever praising and thanking God for the miracles which he performed us, right? So Maimonides is going to say Hanukkah is important. And then he's going to say, even if one has nothing to eat except what he gets from charity, he should borrow or sell his garment to buy lamps and light them. In other words, even if you are you're so poor, right, you're only getting food from the food pantry, you should even try to sell your shirt in order to get money to light Hanukkah lamps, right? This is how important Hanukkah is. He goes on, he says, therefore, if one only has a limited amount of money and the mitzvot available to him are either Kiddush of Shabbat or lighting of the Hanukkah candles, preference should be given to buying oil for lighting of the Hanukkah candles over buying wine for Kiddush. Since both are mitzvot instituted by the sages, one gives preference to the Hanukkah candles as they have an additional component of recalling the miracle, right? So you only have enough money to either buy grape juice or wine for Kiddush on Friday or enough money to light Hanukkah candles, right? Hanukkah candles comes first. But then Maimonides says something else, which Hartman's going to turn into a philosophy of politics. He says, if a poor person must choose between Shabbat candles and Hanukkah candles, or between Shabbat candles and wine for Kiddush, the lighting of his home takes priority so as to sustain peace in the house. Right? And then he concludes, greatest peace since the entire Torah has been created to give peace in the world. As it says, its ways are ways of pleasantness and all its paths are peace. So Maimonides concludes and he says there is one ritual that takes precedence over Hanukkah candles, and that is Shabbat candles, because the idea of Shabbat candles is a principle called Shalom Bayit, right, or, having peace at home, and peace takes precedent over commemorating the miracle of Hanukkah, right? This is Maimonides' formulation. In Hartman's understanding, this is a radical theologic or philosophic debate about what is the most important in Judaism. Hanukkah represents uh, a military victory, right, and big picture politics, right? If you think about Hanukkah historically, Hanukkah represents the overcoming of the Seleucid Empire by the Maccabees to reclaim the Beit HaMikdash, the Temple, and Jerusalem, and usher in a period of Jewish political autonomy, right? Hanukkah was the last time Jews had political autonomy in Israel before Zionism, was the period of the Hashmonai dynasty, right, or the Maccabees, as they're more commonly known. Shabbat, right? Shabbat is in some way very small, right? Shabbat is not, right? The Shabbat candles are not this big historic event of military victory and politics. Candles at home at Shabbat are a very peaceful way to in some warmth and some light as you're about to eat your meal. And so for Hartman, this again was a philosophic debate of what is the most important thing in Judaism, right? Is it these big sweeping military victories and politics, or is it ushering in peace and ushering in again ways to create peace between different people? And he's going to turn this into again his philosophy of how to understand a traditional Jewish idea, but how to read that in the light of new political realities, where his message was there's more to Israel than political triumphalism, right? Again, he was certainly a Zionist, so he's not anti-Israel with this, but he's saying, and he spends most of his career, and we'll spend commenting about Zionism. We'll see his most famous example in 1 second, ensuring that people in Israel understand that, for Hartman at least, Zionism cannot be blind political triumphalism, because in Judaism we clearly have values that are higher than political triumphalism. This being one interesting example of how to read this into our Jewish tradition, right? This is just one example of his methodology of taking 1,000-year-old Jewish ideas and Jewish debates and applying it in light of new Jewish reality. But let's get to his most famous and provocative essay, which is an essay called "Auschwitz or Sinai." Right? It's already by the title you can probably tell that it's a meant to clickbait. I think he wrote this before there was computers, so, or 1982. So I don't know if that was before computers or not. There's probably some big computer sitting there, but before the average person had a computer, certainly. And Hartman is going to set up a fascinating dichotomy. And I said before, Hartman was born in the 1930s, which means he would have been in elementary school essentially during the Holocaust. And so in many ways, Hartman is the first generation of post-Holocaust Jewish thinkers, right? In other words, he was not of age. He was not, 25 years old and thinking about the world critically during the Holocaust. He was, 10 years old during the Holocaust. And so in many ways, what Hartman is going to do, and I'll give you the broad conclusion, and then we'll get into some of his more specific claims, is Hartman is essentially going to say to the Jewish community, the Holocaust cannot be our North Star of how to understand Judaism and Jewish continuity. Now, one way to think about this, right, I'll sort of take a step back. And if you took the modern Jewish thought class with me, I think it was last summer, we spent a whole class on a thinker named Emil Fackenheim, right? Emil Fackenheim came out as one of the leading Jewish theologians after the Holocaust. He ended up being a big Reform rabbi in North America after the Holocaust. And Fackenheim's theology after the Holocaust was the role of Judaism today, right? Today meaning, the 1950s, but he would still apply that today, is to what he called not give Hitler a posthumous victory. In other words, the point of today is to not let Hitler win, right? We need to continue being Jews. We have no right to stop being Jews, because look at how we've survived against all odds and how many people have tried to stop us from being Jews. Therefore, we must double down on our Jewishness. In other words, you can think of it as the goal of Judaism in some way, in its most meta level or most, sociologic level, is to not let the anti-Semites win, right? There are people trying to erase us, and our goal as Jews is to ensure that they don't win, right? Hitler doesn't win, or the modern versions of anti-Semites, or Hitler doesn't win. And Hartman is going to spend this essay teasing out that idea and ultimately rejecting it. And so he's going to write as follows. He says, one of the fundamental issues facing the new spirit of maturity in Israel is Should Auschwitz or Sinai be the orienting category shaping our understanding of the rebirth of the state of Israel? Right? So he says that the Jewish community has a choice to make, right? That choice is Auschwitz or Sinai, right? And here's what he says about Auschwitz. He says, one often hears in speeches in the Knesset and at the UJA fundraising dinners phrases such as, never again will we be vulnerable. Never again will we expose our lives to the ugly political forces in the world. Our powerful army has eliminated the need to beg for pity and compassion from the nations of the world. So he says, while I respect and share in the anguish expressed in these sentiments, I believe it is destructive to make the Holocaust the dominant organizing category of modern Jewish history and of our national renewal and rebirth. It is both politically and morally dangerous for our nation to perceive itself essentially as the suffering remnant of the Holocaust. It is childish and often vulgar to attempt to demonstrate how the Jewish people's suffering is unique in history. Nonetheless, there are individuals obsessed with the trauma of the Holocaust who proclaim that no one can judge the Jewish people. No nation has the right to call us to moral judgment. We need not take the moral criticism of the world seriously because of the uniqueness of our suffering placed above the moral judgment of an immoral world. Those who make such statements judge others but refuse to be judged, and in doing so, a basic Jewish principle is violated. No one may judge if he refuses to judge himself, right? So Hartman is going to say, right, this one half, right, the people who want to view Auschwitz as the defining category of the Jewish people, right? It's clear what the role of Israel and Zionism and even Jewish organizations are now, right? It's ensuring never again on a political or ethnic level, right? The role of Israel is to be strong. And even more so, in many ways, Israel is sheltered from any possible criticism that it can possibly have because how can a world that allows the Holocaust to happen in the same breath also criticize Israel, right? For people that make Auschwitz the defining category, right? Once Auschwitz happens, right, Jewish people have become such a, in one thinker's terms, right, Jews have become the ultimate leper in the world. And, why does the leper care if people in the city are saying another additional bad thing about the leper, right? You just sort of ignore them, right? And so one of the defining characteristics of taking Auschwitz as the defining North Star of the Jewish community is also not really being open to criticism about Israel. He then is going to compare this, and I figured I would just put the original essay up here. I'm happy to send this out after because I didn't know exactly which excerpts to quote, so we can just go to the to the end of his essay. So he writes, the model of Sinai. Where did I go? The model of Sinai awakens the Jewish people to the awesome responsibility of becoming a holy people. At Sinai, we discover the absolute demand of God. We discover who we are by what we do. Sinai calls us to action, to moral awakening, to living constantly with the challenges of building a moral and just society which mirrors the kingdom of God in history. Sinai creates humility and openness to the demands of self-transcendence. In this respect, it is the antithesis of moral narcissism that can result from suffering and viewing oneself as a victim. So Hartman was extremely against Jews victimizing themselves, right? Jews getting into this victim mentality where because we received hate, right, we are inured from any type of criticism coming our way. But for Hartman, right, again, he wasn't saying, therefore just listen to whatever the UN is saying about Israel, right? That's not what he was saying in terms of his philosophic view about Israel. He's saying that fundamentally, we have a higher demand, right, as Jews, and as somebody, again, unlike Yeshayahu Lebowitz, who believes that Zionism is a part of Judaism, right? Zionism must be informed by Jewish values. Therefore, because Judaism is centered around Sinai, this covenant with God to become a moral and just and godly people, Zionism must live up to that as well, right? And he goes on, he says, Sinai requires of the Jew that he believes in the possibility of interrogating the moral seriousness of the prophet with the realism and political judgment of the statesman. Politics and morality were united when Israel was born as a nation at Sinai. Sinai prohibits the Jewish people from ever abandoning the effort of creating a shared moral language with the nations of the world. And then he writes as follows, the rebirth of Israel can be viewed as a return to the fullness of the Sinai covenant, to Judaism as a way of life. The moral and spiritual aspirations of the Jewish tradition were not meant to be realized in Shabbat sermons or by messianic dreamers who wait passively on the margins of society for redemption to break miraculously into history. Torah study is not a substitute for actual life, nor are prayers and the synagogue escapes from the ambiguities and complexities of political life. The Jewish world will have to learn that the synagogue is no longer the exclusive defining framework for Jewish communal life. Moral seriousness and political maturity and wisdom must come to our attention if we are to be judged by the way we struggle to interrogate the Sinai covenant with the complexities of political reality. So just to summarize this, and again, I can send out the entire essay if one wants to read it. For Hartman, right, just to kind of conclude, and then I'll explain those last lines because I think it's a nice formulation of everything we've discussed. Judaism is a dynamic system, right? Jews, to be Jewish is to engage in a covenant with God, right? Constantly not ignoring, but not just, blindly following, but engaging in the critical thinking, both intellectual and moral, that demands people in partnership. And that is very much the way that Jews relate to God. For Hartman, Zionism is both a continuity of Jewish tradition, but it is a radical new period in history where now for the first time, right, and what he sort of spoke about with Shabbat sermons, right, when Jews were in exile, right, if you go to Poland in the 1600s, right, Jews had control over fairly little, right, and so Judaism was relegated to the synagogue in many ways. For Hartman, now that there is a Jewish state, that Jewish state becomes in many ways a reflection of Judaism, and it must take into account all of the ethical, moral, and, what he calls the political history of the Jewish people, right? One other way to think of this, right, and I've heard this formulated as well by many in Hartman, at the current Hartman Institute, is Jews have been debating questions of ethics and politics for 2,000 years. But for 2,000 years, much of that debate was hypothetical because Jews were not in control of politics, right? So it's one thing for me to sit around and say, if I ever become a community leader, here's what I'm going to do. It's another thing, what do I actually do once I become a community leader, right? And for Hartman, Jews talking in the diaspora and exile about ethics and responsibility, right, is one thing, right? It's very easy to say, I'm going to be very ethical when you have nothing, right? And I've actually heard David Hartman's son, Daniel Hartman, has this very provocative line, right? Some of you will not like this, but he starts many of his speeches by saying that the most ethical person in the world, the most ethical person in the world were people in Auschwitz, right? In other words, if you are in Auschwitz, right, you have no ethical responsibility, and so nobody could critique you ethically, right? On the flip side, if you have all the power in the world, right, that comes with an enormous amount of ethical responsibility. And so to flip the Jewish vantage point from thinking about ourselves as we're still in Auschwitz, in other words, we have no moral responsibility, to all the way on the other side thinking, hey, we actually have a viable state. Jews have power, Jews have a strong army. That gives Jews this ethic of responsibility back, which then allows Jews to bring in our multi-thousand-year Jewish history into thinking about how are we going to balance political realism with many of the ethical demands that Judaism has been giving for thousands of years. And Hartman's point is that this is not easy, right? Unlike other thinkers who say, well, here's what I think, right? It's going to be very easy, right? They're very utopic. For David Hartman, Jewish tradition is not easy. In other words, Jewish tradition constantly involves different debates between different schools of thinking and struggling and wrestling with these wide ideas. And so the state of Israel must reflect that constant, that deeply Jewish idea of wrestling with all of these questions. But it is not what he is saying we should not do is try to overly simplify either Jewish tradition into something like the Shulchan Aruch or Israel into saying, well, everybody hates us and we need a state, so therefore we're just going to do whatever we want. For Hartman, that would be, deeply sad and deeply tragic. And the last thing that I'll add is that the Hartman Institute over the last 40 years or so has been instrumental in, I think, pushing Israel in a lot of these things. So just the Hartman Institute every year educates, hundreds of public school teachers in the Israeli system. One of the things that I mentioned last week is the Hartman Institute was one of the main co-authors of the IDF Code of Ethics. For those that have never read the Israeli Defense Force Code of Ethics, it's fascinating because it is in some way exactly what we're talking about now. It is a mix of both traditional Jewish ideas with conversations about pragmatic reality, as if to say, to be a Jewish soldier means both, right? You can't be, idealist. You can't have your head in the sand and, just be hypothetical, but also you can't just be overly pragmatic that you lose sight of these wider grand ideas that a covenantal Judaism has constantly been trying to evoke out of us. So that is Hartman at a bird's eye view. Again, happy to stay for any and all questions, and then I'll give a brief 90-second introduction to next week. Perfect. I'll do the introduction for next week, and then we'll see if anybody wants to hang out and have questions. So next week's actually the is actually probably the least well-known thinker. He's actually the only thinker who's still alive on our list. He's a rabbi named Haim Amsalem. The reason why I chose him was because very few people know about him. So if you've never heard of him, right, then I've done my job. I actually only found out about him about a year ago, which I'll discuss some of the reasons why. But Haim Amsalem used to be in the Israeli Knesset. He's now a Sephardic rabbi with a relatively large following in Israel. And Chaim Amsalem is going to spends his life trying to reclaim what he calls the authentic Sephardic tradition against what he believes, how it's been hijacked by not just Ashkenazi Jews, but by modernity. And this is going to be a fascinating conversation about dynamics between the Ashkenazi and Sephardic community, both in history and in modern day Israeli politics, and also a fascinating debate, again, touching on many of these questions of, what is the purpose of Judaism and Jewish law? Is it to remain unchanging, or should Jewish law change with, modern times, and how much should that go in either direction? And the figure of Chaim Amsalem, again, is just a perfect case study into that. And so I'm very excited for that next week. But thank you, everybody, so much for coming. Again, I'm more than happy to stay and hang out if people have thoughts or questions about Hartman. And if not, I will say have a wonderful Monday, everyone, and I will see you next Monday morning.
Great class. Thank you so much, Rabbi. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.